I'm really running out of things to talk about in this redundant series. So Mega Man 1 was Mega Man. Mega Man 2 was Mega Man, but without the slippery controls. Mega Man 3 added the slide. Mega Man 4 added the Mega Buster. Mega Man 5 didn't really add anything of note. What did Mega Man 6 do? All about the jetpack! Alright, so this game hit the US in 1994, basically in the midpoint between the launch of the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64. Everything you've heard me say in the past few NES videos, all that stuff about frequent releases, sales numbers, games being forgotten, the quality of the stages improving, the colors and production value increasing, it all still applies here. Mega Man 6 had even less sales than 4 and 5. It was even more forgettable than the two of them. And for all accounts, it looked better than the previous two titles, and had all of the same level of improvements that the previous two titles had. I don't really think it's worth dwelling on that. It's fairly commonly known now, but Nintendo of America published this game in the West because Capcom didn't think it was worth their time. And to be fair, they were right. Nintendo published it and pushed it alongside the top-loader NES in hopes that it'd help generate sales considering it was releasing so late in the next console's life. I don't even know if it was really worth it. But that's neither here nor there. We have a game created on the back of 5 more games, and I want to see how it actually feels to play today compared to those previous titles. And honestly, I'm almost inclined to call this game Mega Man 4 Part 2. While I still think Mega Man 4 is the most complete Mega Man experience when it comes to usefulness of the weapons and the Mega Man formula, and Mega Man 5 is a game that's best played with a default Mega Buster since I found the weapons to be somewhat pointless, I think Mega Man 6 sits somewhere in between the two of those titles in regards to how the weapons are used and how the Mega Man formula is implemented, and it sits much closer to Mega Man 4 than it does to 5. Obviously, in this game, the most significant additions are the jetpack and the power suit. There are no rush tools. Rather, Mega Man fuses with Rush and gets those two powers. The jet adapter allows you to slowly boost upwards and briefly hover in place, really helping you in both the exploration and platforming. And the power adapter gives you ability to really mow through some of the enemies and break down big environmental blocks that often lead to hidden paths and usually have a 1-up or health or ammo regenerator behind it. As such, most stages in this game have at least 1 or 2 moments where you can use the jetpack or the adapter to take an alternate route. And in those routes, you're usually rewarded for your curiosity with an easier section or some sort of collectible treat. In fact, 4 out of the 8 stages in this game have alternate paths right before the final boss, and if you take the more difficult path, that being the one that requires you to use the jet or power adapter to reach, then you gain access to one of the beat letters. 4 beat letters unlocks Beat, but I'll be honest, he's kinda useless in this game because you have a lot more to work with. Would have been nice to at least be able to use him in the final boss, but spoiler alert, he doesn't do anything. Anyway, the power adapter to some extent feels like it could have just been a Robot Master weapon that you gain. But regardless, I like its implementation that rewards your curiosity. The power jet, on the other hand, is a whole other level. Like, I think I used the jet more in this game than I did the Mega Buster. Not since the slide did I feel an addition to Mega Man's moveset was so useful. And the great thing is, I think they actually did a good job designing the stages around the thought that you'd have the jetpack. There are a lot of challenges now that require your careful use of the jet and timing to get through. Okay, maybe require is not the right word to use because you can go through the 8 stages without the jetpack, since you only unlock it when you beat a specific stage. In the same vein that the rush jet used to be unlocked if you beat a specific stage. But many of the stages have platform sections that clearly have the jet adapter in mind. Honestly, not since the Metal Saw in Mega Man 2 did I feel something so clearly was the best tool to use throughout the game. But the difference is in Mega Man 6, I think you're sacrificing a lot more when you stick to the jetpack. There are lots of moments in this game where it's more in your interest to use the Mega Buster or power adapter, or of course one of the Robot Master weapons. And it just kinda depends on what you're doing at that specific time. Obviously, during the 8 Robot Master fights, I didn't find any use in the jetpack and found the weakness to be much stronger than in recent games, allowing it to be much more favorable to experiment and use the Robot Master's weaknesses than it is to just settle with the Mega Buster. Something that I couldn't say the same for in Mega Man 5, for instance. And in addition to that, the Mega Buster has the same nerf as it did in Mega Man 5, where you lose your charge if you get hit, so it's more difficult to pull off using it than otherwise. Also, I can't say for certain, but I think the width of the Mega Buster shot is not as large as the one in Mega Man 5. And the patterns the Robot Masters make during the battles are also not totally difficult, but not as easy to predict as they were in that game. So you end up in a situation where you can totally get through a Robot Master if you don't have their weakness, but it is significantly more in your interest to get to that Robot Master with their weakness if you're able to. Otherwise, you'll realistically have to burn through an E-Tank. At least, that was the case for me. The game is pretty generous with E-Tanks too. If anything, that's probably the main thing that'll make sure you get through the game if you're a newcomer, like I am. And if not, you can probably do a no E-Tank run or something if you're looking for that old school feel because you're in your 40s or a masochist or both. Beyond that, there's a single hidden collectible that involves finding Proto Man, and he'll reward you, and it's the weapon balancer. And then obviously there are the 8 Robot Master weapons. The Robot Masters and their stages all take inspiration from real-world locations, but I'll hold off on going through all of that, as well as the story and the presentation as I go through the playthrough. As far as the weapons are concerned, you have a barrier, a time stopper, a rapid-fire projectile, one that arches upwards, one that shoots up from the ground, one that fires multiple projectiles lined up vertically, and one that carries enemies upwards, and one that shoots forward and comes back to you. Most of these are derivatives of weapons from previous games, and many of them even reuse elements like air, ice, and fire. But as a package, as a whole, they are all pretty useful. And they're all pretty strong too. It obviously depends on the order of which you play the stages, and part of the fun of Mega Man is to customize your own experience by experimenting, but in my playthrough I found use for all the weapons as I went through it. And obviously by the end of the game I found one or two that I favored more than the others, so I tended to stick to those. The difference is that in this game, the jet and the power adapter are part of that cycle and are very useful as well. So by the end of the game you have 10 realistic options of things to choose from as you go through the stages, and even 11 if you count beat. And for the most part, all of them are decent if not good choices. A few of them can be situational, but spotting when to use them is all part of the fun. And again, I'd say that was the case in Mega Man 4, 3, and to some extent 2, and as well as 1, even though some weapons were significantly better than others in those games. It's only really Mega Man 5 that I felt was really forcing myself to experiment and not jiving. The one flaw, if you can call it a flaw, is that the jet and the power adapter are so useful you might not even want to experiment. But I think that's all a matter of preference. After my Mega Man 4 video, many people stated that they strictly play with the Mega Buster, and that's fine. I just like that you have the option to use them. Also, at the end of the game, the power adapter was the best thing to use against most of the final bosses too. So I'd go through most of the stages with a jet, and most of the final boss with the power adapter, and whatever was left over was split between the weapons. But the weapons did find a great deal of use during the boss rush since they were way better to use than the Mega Buster in this game as I stated previously. By the end of the game, it all came down to one simple question for me. Did the jet, power adapter, and Mega Buster sour the experience and make Mega Man 6 redundant in the same way that Mega Man 5 was? And honestly, no it didn't. The inclusion of the jet and power adapter alone make Mega Man 6 a unique enough experience where I think it can stand on its own and shouldn't be overlooked. In fact, Mega Man 6 is probably the most unique experience because of the jet. I'd almost recommend suggesting people always go through Plant Man stage first just to make sure you have the jetpack as soon as you can. Because that way, the whole concept of weighing your options and figure out what to use can be implemented starting from the second stage you play. Do I fly, or do I use the Mega Buster? That's a much more difficult question to ask yourself than do I use a pea shooter or do I use a charge shot? And it makes for a much more intriguing experience. Everything beyond that just makes the game even better. The power adapter brings in something else to the checks and balance systems. Do I sacrifice my jump and speed for strength? And then the 8 weapons, all being very useful, add on more questions. And even if you don't use the 8 weapons at all during your regular stages, you still have the fact that they're extremely useful in the boss fights to make them relevant. You might not have to repeat a stage because you can put up a hard fight against a Robot Master and beat them without their weakness, but you might have to repeat one because you didn't have an adapter yet and couldn't get to the alternate ending without the stage and get a beat letter. And guess what? When you repeat that stage, they change the color scheme a bit to make it feel slightly different. And add on to that all of the improvements in the production values and stage designs and enemy placements and challenges, and quite frankly for me, this is easily as good as Mega Man 4. I'd have to do a replay to determine which one I enjoy more, but those two games are easily my favorite of the original 6. Mega Man 4 might get the tiebreaker for Dive Man's music alone, but it'd be very close. After that, it gets a bit difficult to rank. Like, I lean towards saying that 5, then 3, then 2, then 1, but playing Mega Man 2 with a Metal Saw is so fun. And playing Mega Man 3 is better than Mega Man 2 because of its better implementation of the Mega Man formula and its lack of dumb beginner's traps. Plus, 2 doesn't even have a slide. 1 is definitely in last though, but it's not so horrible that I would tell someone to never play it. The gap from 1 to 3 isn't wide enough to say one is drastically better than the other. Anyway, I'm just rambling at this point. My point is that I really like Mega Man 6, and I think it's worth running through my playthrough and going through some specific examples as to why this is definitely in my top 2 favorite games of the series so far, keeping in mind that I've played 13 games between 4 consoles. Let's do this. Oh my god, as soon as I heard this Capcom introduction played, I got all these crazy flashbacks to playing Street Fighter and Aladdin as a kid. Completely forgot about it. Even in 8-bit, it still hits that sweet nostalgic bone. Anyway, the introduction says there's an annual robot tournament being held with 8 of the most powerful robots in the world. Mr. X, the tournament sponsor, went rogue and took control of the robots in an attempt to take over the world. Something tells me Mr. X is actually Mr. W. I-L-Y. Although he claims he's the puppet master manipulating Wily all along and no longer needs his help. prompting Mega Man to grab Rush and head after Mr. X. This is easily the best looking introduction, by the way. I'll say this from now so I don't repeat myself, but this game has so many moments that looks like it could easily be on the Super Nintendo if the colors were just slightly more vibrant. My only gripe is that the title music, and really most of the music around the game save one or two tracks, doesn't really have that oomph, but it's okay, I can still live with what we got. So the 8 robots from around the world each come from their own theme and represent a different part of the world, or at least what a Japanese programmer might think that part of the world looked like back in the early 90s. It's also a bit funny that you have 4 that represent elements and 4 that represent some kind of soldiers. Like you get Flame, Wind, Blizzard, and Plant, which I know aren't 100% Wind, Fire, Water, and Earth, but it's pretty close. But then you get a Samurai and Yamato, a Native Warrior and Tomahawk, and a Medieval Knight, and a Centaur, which I guess represents the ancient Greek creature that was also known to be some extent of a warrior. And I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the 4 stages that have the 4 warriors rather than the element robots are the stages you get the beat letters from, for some reason. But anyways, that's not really all that important. I thought about it for a bit and decided to start with Tomahawk Man. The stage has an old desert western theme, including some cowboy enemies. I noticed these blocks with cracks on them that I couldn't break, obviously because I didn't have the power adapter yet. Also, the tune for this stage is one that I really enjoyed and sounded super familiar. I'm guessing it's something I've heard in the background of YouTube videos because it's catchy. Anyway, after the first section of the stage, you drop underground and have to deal with a charging shield. 2 charge shots take care of him pretty easily, and then you go up against one of these mech gumball machines that take a bunch of hits to get through. When you destroy it, you get to a narrow path where a drill vehicle charges at you. A fully charged shot plus an extra pea shooter will take care of it, or you can just spam the pea shooter if you have time. Nothing so far is excruciating, but I did have low health, and did run into an eddy that gave me an E-tank. When I climbed up, I noticed a ladder in the sky, but since I don't have the jet yet, I can't access it. Next up, there are some challenges with these skull robots along your way that are pretty easy to get through. When you drop down, there's this giant robot that hovers around and slams down onto you that cost me my first life. On my second life, I noticed how good the rippling sun in the background looked during a sunset, which I really appreciated to set the mood of the stage. And then when I dropped back down this time, I guess I just damage boosted past the heavy robot. I faced off against another mech gumball machine, noticed a split path, but obviously I couldn't get to the lower part yet, so I quickly ran through the upper path and noticed another block I couldn't destroy. Random side note, this is the block to destroy with the power adapter if you want to get the energy balancer. In the previous screen, if you had the jetpack and you took the lower path to get to the beat letter, you wouldn't be able to get to destroy this block. So basically in my playthrough, I'd have had to go through this stage 3 times if I wanted the energy balancer. But I didn't know the energy balancer was even in this game at the time, so I went through the whole game without knowing it and without finding Proto Man. Which I'm not too mad about because I don't really think it's all that useful of an item in this game. But anyway, from an explorative angle, I think they do a good job encouraging exploration with rush adapters, and this is a prime example of how they make it unique. As you continue to move up to get through a final stretch of enemies over some spikes until you make it to Tomahawk Man. He wasn't the most difficult to maneuver around, but I did lose my first life since I was low on health. And I ended up having to use an E-tank rather than lose a second life and having to restart since it did take me quite a bit of damage to get comfortable against him until I felt like I could take him on. I also eventually gave up on the Mega Buster and started spamming the pea shooter, because his attacks kept getting rid of my charge shot. Anyway, easy peasy, let's move on. Thankfully, next up I want to get into Plant Man. I'm glad I got to him early. I love this early part of the stage that's a forest theme. It's like Woodman's stage, but so much nicer and better in quality aesthetically speaking. You climb upwards and it seems like this is all built inside of a tree, or at least the trees around it. Eventually you make it to this tank, that I swear is modeled after the Gutsman tank from the previous games, but apparently it's a gorilla, so it just reminds me of Donkey Kong. It did defeat me and I had to restart the stage. So I equipped the Tomahawk and I found it to be very strong and useful in its upward trajectory. I did have to switch to a Mega Buster and burn through the E-tank for the gorilla tank because the Tomahawk didn't do anything. Or at least I thought it didn't do anything, but it turns out you have to hit the tank in the head. Anyway, as the stage went on, I mostly used a Mega Buster to get through the bouncing challenges that had spikes overhead and faced off against another gorilla tank before dying over a bottomless pit that a fish robot jumped out of. I got through the gorilla again and ended up with 1 hit point, but I had no more E-tanks. So the rest of the stage was a slow crawl, until I found some health bits in the tree during this challenge where you have to shoot these closed platforms so they can open up. This whole area of the stage is a very unique challenge because you're bouncing on springs basically all the way across, and you can control the height of your bounce by holding the jump button. But when you get past it, you'll make it to Plant Man. His attack is a typical shield that you can use to protect, which is not really new or unexpected in the series at this point. I found the Tomahawk was kinda useless against a plant, so I decided to stick with the Mega Buster because his projectile was easily avoidable. I mostly took damage when he'd corner me, but eventually I got the final hit in. Thankfully too, because my health was getting really close. Anyway, I got the jetpack now, so it's time to move on. So I noticed on the main screen that the Plant Man box had a 1-up symbol, whereas the Tomahawk Man stage was just an empty box. I figured that meant the Tomahawk stage would have something required for me to collect, but eventually I figured out it was just a beat letter, so it didn't really matter unless I really wanted beat. Anyway, for some reason I decided to go to Centaur Man. I equipped the jet and basically flew over most of the challenges in the stage. Well, first I got a game over, and then I started flying over the challenges in the stage. I say fly over, but I don't mean literally since you can't fly for that long. But I was definitely utilizing the jetpack in the stage in the low gravity water sections. It made it a lot easier to control my elevation to defeat different enemies, especially when I got to the area when the water level lowers from the top of the stage. Combining the jet with the fact that you have the water overhead instead of below you where it usually is makes the challenge a lot easier to get through, but it also requires a bit of skill for you to tactfully maneuver through the change in gravity while utilizing your jet. In the next area, I found these ground enemies that I could not defeat at all, so I damage boosted. I never did figure out how to beat them, but after I finished the game I learned a power shot would have done the trick. In the next area, I found Eddie, followed by another section over water where there are submarines that fall out of the clouds and attack you when they land in the water. I also had to go through a squid before getting to the boss stage. I decided to go through the top route since I had the jetpack and I could fly over the gap and made it to Centaur Man, who has a very predictable pattern. Also, his attack freezes you in place. It's another one of those gimmicky attacks from previous games. I unloaded the tomahawk on him and that took his health down to about a quarter of the way. The rest of the fight involved very careful dodging, but he's much easier to beat as long as you don't get screwed and frozen by him. Which, yeah, that happens quite a bit. And with Centaur Man defeated, I moved on to Windman, a stage that takes place in the sky, I guess. At this point I was kinda getting sick of my pea shooter in the boss fights, so I figured fire would be strong against the blizzard, which means that maybe the wind would put out the fire. So I went to the Windman stage and I used a Centaur Flash to knock out some giant pandas pretty quickly. I also used the Tomahawk attack quite a bit too, actually. It made the beginning parts of the stage very quick before we got up to the sky. There are some fans that blow you upwards, so you have to carefully utilize them to get through. Also, since I was up in the sky, I figured the jet adapter would be my best friend, and it definitely was. And then I figured out that the pandas were very weak and easy to defeat, so I could just stick with the jetpack through the rest of the stage. I even got to restock some ammo and health before making over a Windman, which was super convenient. Also, even more convenient, and unplanned, Centaur Flash quickly took down Windman's health. I think the tactic is not to spam it though, but I can't say for certain. I waited for him to stop flashing before I used the weapon and it seemed to work just fine against him. Next up, Flame Man. He has a turban, pointy shoes, an Arabian theme, and a palace, and literal oil all over the stage. Well done, Capcom. Anyway, the oil is harmless, but there are enemies that drop fire onto there and could really do damage if you're stuck in the oil. I of course stuck with the rush jet and really flew through a lot of the stage. Literally. There was a lot of maneuvering, and I still had to defeat quite a few enemies and carefully plan my bursts in the air to avoid taking damage from enemies or falling into the fire, but I got through the stage pretty easily, all things considered. And I got to Flame Man, and with the wind attack, I really just blew him away. Next up was Blizzard Man. The floor is slippery in this one, and you face off against some walruses too. There are also some ice walls that you can destroy with a flame shot and bombs with timers you set off to clear your path as you traverse. I got to use the flame to collect an E-tank and noticed it was very strong against most of the enemies in the stage, which makes sense since it's a flame in an ice stage. I also got to experience using the power adapter for the first time and destroyed a block and was rewarded with health. Also, the power adapter let me Falcon Punch the next squid I faced. The next challenge takes place against a rising and lowering submarine. As you go through it, you also have to defeat some Joes on turrets and maybe break a block of ice or two just to get some health, as well as an E-tank where applicable. Finally, you jump through some bombs again and make your way up and basically just use the jet to avoid the bomb challenges altogether. First life is a quick death. I accidentally used all of my flame attack too, so the flame blast only took Blizzard down to about 1/3 of the health remaining. Nothing else really worked except for the pea shooter, but that's fine, I was able to get through the fight without hell freezing over. I got really lucky in this playthrough because Centaur, Wind, Fire, and Ice were 4 fights in a row that I had the weakness for. My choice now was to choose between Nightman or Yamato Man. It was a toss-up, but I decided to go for the Knight. It takes place in a medieval castle. I mean, just such a good looking stage. You get through the castle and face off against a similar challenge as the submarine, but in this case the ceiling of spikes lowers as you traverse. I actually started off this stage without finding too much use with the jetpack because of the way the stage was laid out. There wasn't that much room to fly in. I figured the Mega Buster was my best interest. There were a lot of enemies that I damage boosted through that the adapter would have taken care of, but I didn't realize it. I made it back up to the top of the castle and finally grabbed the jetpack to get an E-tank, dropped down to an area where both the roof and floor are very bouncy before finding some blocks to break through to get me to the alternate entrance to Nightman's stage. In hindsight, I should have gone for Yamato Man first, because of course in a game made in Japan, they'd have the knight's weakness be the samurai. But I didn't really think about that when I was picking the stage. I did some experimenting and I lost a life figuring out that nothing was really strong against Nightman, but I did learn his pattern. He throws a mace at you, and if you pull back it stops before it hits you, and you get a chance to unload a bunch of shots at him. Honestly, the most difficult part of this fight was me experimenting with every weapon I had because I thought for sure I had what was needed to defeat him since I had all but one weapon. Anyway, I had to burn through an E-tank and I stuck with the Mega Buster since I figured out how he moved. With that all done, I went to Yamato Man stage. Also, I had the A and T letters, so I was right, I'd have to redo Tomahawks after. Yamato Man stage is Japanese themed. There are even samurai enemies along your path, including one sitting atop a giant frog which, funnily enough, reminds me of Naruto. Also, by this point, I had been taking alternate paths in a lot of the stages because the power adapter and rush adapter allowed me to. I don't think the alternate paths drastically change the experience, but I know you're often rewarded with a goodie if you take the alternate path. One such alternate path led to a boss fight too for the beat letter. I didn't realize I only had one life remaining, so I did have to burn through an E-tank, but I did figure out the Tomahawk is strong against him, so that was nice. That means I knew 5 weaknesses before making it to the boss rush, and I think that's gotta be some kind of record for me. And with the process of elimination, I quickly realized the element's weakness chain goes Wind, Fire, Blizzard, Plant, and the soldier's weakness chain goes Tomahawk, Yamato, Knight, Centaur, making this the only game where I probably would never have to look up anything for a repeat playthrough as long as I remember to start with either Wind or Tomahawk. Granted, I'd probably slightly adjust that and start with Plant first to get the Jet, and then I'd go to Wind so that by the time I finish off the 4 elements and make it to the Knights, I have both adapters and can get to the beat letters and won't have to repeat any of the stages unless I want the energy balancer. Oh wow, look at me. 6 games in and for the first time I'm actually creating my own strategy. Is this what it's like to Mega Man? Alright, next up I went back to Tomahawk Man stage so I can get the beat letter. And look, I know it isn't much, but I absolutely love that on my replay of this stage the theme is slightly altered so that it's nighttime. The sun has set and the colors have slightly changed. The game knows the stage is a replay and it's making it a tiny bit worth your while. Next up is Mr. X's Fortress. The first stage actually looks like it could have been a fortress from literally any game I've played before. There's always like a gray building and a black theme, and this one just has more detail. Thankfully, you get to use the jetpack quite a bit, and the jet is the most enjoyable thing for me to use in this game. I found the Centaur Flash very useful in areas where it was hard to reach some annoying enemies too. Also, there was a challenge here that really required precision to platform across and use the power adapter to break through and reward an alternate route with a lot of regenerators, which I didn't really need since everything was restocked before the stage. But the route was really easy, and I quickly made it to the first boss of this fortress. I equipped the power adapter, and just punch these things a bunch of times. Piece of cake. Next stage had a space theme. It also had some really narrow pathways and a few sections over spikes you needed to fly over, as well as challenges where the floor disappears and you could fall through and it trains you to learn before getting to more of those floors over spikes again. It's all very narrow, with minor challenges, easy challenges to be honest, and you make it to an enemy on a wall. Given the placement of this thing, I figure the Tomahawk works strictly due to its trajectory. I didn't even bother using anything else. The next stage starts you off with a quick chance to get an E-tank and a 1-up. Typical endgame stuff. You also have to defeat a samurai to continue before you make it to some thin platforming areas with spikes overhead and bottomless pits underneath and a ton of flying enemies trying to throw you off your balance. The jet is very useful until you get to an area where there's an alternate path using the power adapter. And after that, it's more of the same early challenge stuff that you can fly over and damage boost through, before once again punching your way through a block to make it to the next boss fight. Honestly, for this one, I just kind of ran through the weapons and saw everything was working pretty well, but I think the Blizzard was doing a better job actually hitting the target, so it was very easy to use. And the final stage of the fortress starts off with more of the same. The challenges get harder though, and you have to use your brain in a few instances to figure out how to maneuver since you have to juggle between the power adapter and sliding while avoiding turrets. The power adapter is actually needed in some of the areas to close off the enemy portals too. And as you advance through the stage and make it through a hallway of Metroid-like robots, you continue to take alternate paths that require you to use one of your adapters so that you can get more goodies to stock up and going into the end of the game. The game does trick you though, because there's another portal to close to stop the endless chain of enemies, but if you close it, you actually block off your chance to collect an E-tank. Granted, by now I had 5 E-tanks, but I wanted 6. Well, I went back to 5 quickly because I used it immediately, but still. I finally made it to Mr. X, another power adapter boss. I think any enemies that you can get close enough to defeat with a power adapter are best defeated with the power adapter. It just packs such an amazing punch. Also, again, E-tanks always help. When he's defeated, Mr. X takes off his disguise, and of course, it's Wily. And now we're at Wily's fortress. The Mr. X stages seemed easy now in hindsight, but I did use a lot of E-tanks to get through them, so maybe they weren't as simple as I'm making them out to be. But these Wily stages definitely kick it up a notch. I tried starting off using Beat, but quickly realized he's not all that useful in this game. The opening area also requires both the jet and power adapter to get through comfortably. I stuck with the jet because it was very useful in a lot of these quickfall sections, until I made it to a block and was able to destroy it to get an E-tank and refill some health. I continued along and honestly I just jumped past a squid and a Joe and just went to the boss room to face a dinosaur. I tried the power adapter at first, but I wasn't really able to do anything. I burned through the spare arrow attack and got it down to about half health, and took care of the rest of it with a pea shooter or mega buster if I was able to charge it up fast enough. Obviously though, I had to use an E-tank. I was aiming for the eyes, but I think I should have been aiming for the mouth. Otherwise, it might have been able to not use an E-Tank. Thankfully, right at the start of the next stage, E-Tank. Now this stage seems like it's a bit frozen over. There's an invisible block challenge to get through, but it's mostly just figuring out how to use your jetpack and quickly switch to use a slide. There was an alternate path on the right that the flame attack probably would have been the right move for, but in my mind the left one was the more difficult challenge. I guess I was wrong. Anyway, as you continue, there are a lot of areas with spikes, or I guess icicles on the ceiling, so you just need to make sure you stay low while platforming. The next enemy was a ground tank. When the power adapter failed me, I jumped around a bit and saw the wind attack was very strong against it. And then the next stage is an underwater stage. Right off the bat, a bunch of regenerators and E-Tanks to set you up for the pending boss rush, of course. There are a lot of piranhas as you go through the section as well, and fans that try and blow you towards the spikes. When you climb up, there's a room with some turrets and you get to a boss rush. I already spoke quite a bit about the boss rushes earlier, and the weaknesses chain and the elements and the warriors and how they each have their own chain. I lost a life against Platman, but that was more because I'd rather lose a life than waste an E-Tank. Since I know the final boss is coming up, I still have 4 lives. As per usual, since this was my first playthrough, I liked a boss rush because I could use what I learned to get through it. But next time I play, I'll find it to be a quick nuance. Same old story with every Mega Man game. But man, Flame Man is super racist. Tomahawk Man 2 would probably offend people if this game wasn't made in Japan. Yamato Man might have been as well. And I'm sure someone British would consider the fact that Yamato Man is the knight's weakness is offensive. The 90s were truly so long ago. Anyway, none of this is nearly as bad as Napalm Man debacle. Moving on, final bosses. But before that, Met Gumball Machine. Also a few chances to restock some ammo. Went through the Tomahawk and swapped to a pea shooter and got rid of phase 1. E-Tank for phase 2. It's the same fight, but it's just a bit harder now. Once again, E-Tank, next phase. It's another disappearing Wily capsule. I thought for sure this was Beat's moment, but unfortunately, it was nothing more than a companion. I decided to switch to a jet instead since I could get high enough to land shots no matter how high Wily went. Honestly, I had little care for my health because of the E-Tanks. I burned through them, and only when they finished did I start really focusing defensively, but by that point, Wily didn't stand a chance anymore. And oh man, I love the sight of him tying him up with a rope like he's some kind of Scooby-Doo enemy. Wily was straight up arrested, sentenced to prison, ruling over a prison cell. The world is free of his crimes. There's peace. It's truly the end of an era. The end of a chain of 6 games on a single console. The last game came out before I was even 5 years old. I gotta imagine, if I was a decade older, these games might have had a larger impact on my life, and I might have played through the series much sooner than I actually did. My family had an NES, but by the time I could game, I mostly stuck with the SNES. And the Super Nintendo just had such a larger library that I don't think Mega Man got as much attention as it did on the NES. Even though the X series was considered phenomenal, the SNES just had a phenomenal library anyway. I like to imagine if I was an 80s kid, I'd have more people around me that were into Mega Man, and I might have had the same feeling to Mega Man as I do to Mario or Donkey Kong or Sonic. This is such an iconic franchise, and its humble beginnings have aged pretty well. But I think the wrong games are the ones that are most praised. The first trilogy on the NES was flawed. Mega Man 2 and 3 have major issues. Mega Man 1 does as well, but everyone knows that. But 2 and 3 being the iconic games that everyone pointed towards for years until collections became mainstream was in my opinion a detriment to the series. Because while I think they were fun in the 90s, I don't think as many people found them as fun in the 2000s. Or at least, not as many people as those who would have seen Sonic, Mario, or Donkey Kong as fun games a decade later. But the NES's sequel trilogy, Mega Man 4, 5, and 6, they don't have any of that BS that the first 3 games had. No beginner traps, no screwed up pushback, and the gameplay evolved so much that it feels like a whole other generation of gaming. I guess what I'm trying to say is that while Mega Man 1, 2, and 3 feel like NES games, Mega Man 4, 5, and 6 feel like they could have easily been on the Super Nintendo. And there's only a handful of games I could say that about from the old 8-bit legendary machine. But hey, there's still more to come. I need to finish up the final Game Boy game, as well as Wily Wars to wrap up the first phase of my Mega Man franchise retrospective. I'll see you next time. As always, thanks for watching. Dean out.